All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Anam. I'm a GA at UMKC's Women's Center. Here at the Women's Center, our mission is kind of just doing events and education and awareness about gender equity. All are welcome, but we do kind of consider ourselves this safe space. We have a library, we have free menstrual products, computers that people can use, a coffee machine, just a all-around safe space on campus. And then we'll try to do a lot of outreach events independently and also collaborate with other organizations on campus. So we do something called a Feminist Fireside chat once in a while, where we bring in really cool women to talk about the things that they do. And students are welcome to come and ask questions and kind of listen to all the wisdom that they have to offer. So here I have Dr. Huff-Pomstra with me, and I am going to have her introduce herself. So could you please introduce yourself in a few sentences?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Teresa Huff-Pomstra, she, her pronouns. My current position is a licensed psychologist at the counseling center here at our counseling services here at UMKC. I'm also the interim director, so a little bit busy with doing some of those things. I also head up training, which is how I know Anam. I think me as a person, I mean, that's a part of who I am. But I really like to say that I'm an encourager, I'm a mentor, I'm a friend, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a dog mom now, which is a huge part of my life. And I'm a listener, and I kind of think that I share lots of different roles in my life and lots of ways that I sort of interact with the world that have to do with my work, but also don't. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that. So.
Well, we have a few questions we're going to get into, but anyone, again, is welcome to raise their hand and make a comment or ask a question as kind of we go through. So tell us a little bit more about your educational background and what drew you to it.
Sorry, first I want to ask what kind of dog you have.
Well, she is the light of my wife and I's life for sure. She's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. So if you know what those are, yes. And if you don't, those of you watching out there on stream, if you don't know, it's Think Lady and the Tramp, which is a Cocker Spaniel, and she's kind of a derivative of that. So she's about 13 pounds, about this big. Her name is Sophie, and she is very cute. So.
I remember when I first met Dr. Huff-Pomstra, she was talking about puppy training her.
Oh.
And
yeah, we sort of trained her, but not fully trained her. So it's very difficult to train a dog, I've discovered. So Pavlov made it look very easy, but it's actually not easy. So.
All right. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about your educational background and what drew you to the field that you're practicing.
Yeah, really good question. I'd like to have some, very insightful, sort of deep answer to that question, what drew me to the field. I think you'll find a lot of people who are in the psychology counseling field at some point took an abnormal psychology class and found that really fascinating. And then that kind of what set them off on their path. And so I think for me, that's very true as an undergrad, just having that experience of being kind of fascinated by the human mind. But I think for me also just really being drawn to people who are maybe going through some sort of suffering, or folks who are, dealing with some kind of life's challenges. I think very early on in my life, I had a real sense of empathy for other people. I think that came out when I was a kid in terms of how I would be people's friend on the playground who, other kids wouldn't be friends with them. And I was always sort of drawn to situations like that. And so I think that then naturally kind of through my life, found myself in positions of sort of helping others. And so then I think by the time I became an undergrad, which by the way, I changed my major about 5 times as an undergrad. So I know some people that are listening might have had that same experience and they feel like, oh my gosh, everybody else knows what they're going to do with their life. Anam, I think you had told me at one point you wanted to be a psychologist for forever, right? And that was not my experience. So, but yeah, I think if I could take some of those classes, I was like, wow, I think this is really what I want to do. So I spent, I guess about 10 years or so doing kind of community mental health, case management, sort of more of these kind of entry-level type positions. And I think through that, I got a lot of experience working with people. But I found that at the bachelor's level, there wasn't a lot of opportunity. So if you wanted to go sort of any higher or do more with it, you had to kind of go back to school. So I first started getting my master's around, I guess it was about 2003. And at some point in that program, I kind of panicked and I was like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. And so I kind of went a different direction for a little while. But it was around 2008. I was living in Kansas City. And at some point was like, you know what, I kind of feel I'm still kind of at that place in my life. I had not gotten my degree yet and thought, I think I really want to do this. And I think I'd matured a little bit in life. So yeah, at some point I went to Avila here in Kansas City and got my master's degree. The story of how I came to get my doctorate was I had a professor say, hey, you've kind of got a good mind. I think you might ever thought about getting a PhD. And I was like, no, but sounds good. And so literally I started looking into programs. Yeah, I've always been one who's very ambitious. I want to challenge myself. And I'm like, can I get a PhD? I think I'll try to get a PhD. And so I did. So, yeah. And kind of along the way, I worked a lot with young adults in a lot of different settings and kind of religious settings and community settings. So when I finally kind of got the degree, then the advanced degree, in terms of working with clients, I knew college counseling was going to kind of be my thing. So yeah, so I ended up doing my internship here at UMKC and then got hired on, and I guess I've been here about 7 years now. So I love working with the students. I love working with students like Anam who come in and do their training with us. And so it's really been a rewarding experience kind of all the way around. So yeah.
No, for sure. I feel like UMKC and UMKC counseling is very lucky to have you there.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah. And it's really I'm really glad that you mentioned that, you know, your path to psychology or like to becoming a psychologist wasn't just linear. And I feel like it's important to like normalize that experience for a lot of undergrads who feel like they have to stick to one thing their whole undergrad career. And so I was also like in like pre-med kind of before I switched to psych. And so
that's right. Yeah.
So it's so normal to change until you figure out what you want to do.
Well, and the other thing I'll mention too, I think part of my identity is being a first gen student, you know, and my dad had done a little bit of kind of some kind of community classes or whatever, but he was military. My mom was a secretary, never went past high school. So there was a part of me that was sort of, my dad had always said, you're really smart, you need to go to college. But that was kind of the end of it. He didn't really know how to kind of guide me further. And so I really much identify with these first gen students who are like, I think I belong here, but I'm not sure if I belong here. I'm not really sure how to do this. And so, yeah, so I think that definitely was part of my journey too, was just kind of having to figure it out as I went along. So, yeah.
That's awesome. So kind of, you know, switching towards what we kind of preach here at the Women's Center, like we do a lot of feminist work. So what does feminism mean to you?
Yeah, I read that question and I was like, I went into a panic and I was like, oh my gosh, what's my feminist theory? You know, and all these things. You know, I think authenticity is really, really important as a person, and that's how I practice and it's how I live. And so if I'm really honest, I mean, feminism was something that I really did not come to sort of identify with until probably the last 10 to 12 years. You know, part of my upbringing and part of my story is growing up in a very conservative religious background that was very patriarchal in nature. And there were parts of that I think growing up didn't bother me. I didn't really see through any kind of negative lens necessarily. And so really it wasn't until I think when I went back for my master's the second time, I kind of really evolved a lot for me in sort of my sort of religious thinking and sort of my identifications, and kind of really moved away from that particular belief system. And I think it was during my master's degree, and I'm in my 40s at this point, so like I'm a little bit later in life. And I was finding myself going, you know, this feminism had always been sort of wasn't embraced by the community the religious community I was part of. And so it always been kind of painted as like this negative thing. And so I had to kind of work through some of that, I think, myself. But as I found myself kind of being more and more drawn to that, I realized, oh, I've kind of had some of these thoughts all along. I just didn't have a place that was sort of nurturing that or identifying that for me. But I definitely remember being, you know, a young adult and wanting to do more and wanting to teach and wanting to be in these sort of positions and always feeling like male identified persons were kind of taking those spaces, right? So when I think about feminism now, as I sort of realize like I'm a little maybe late to the game for some folks, but for me, I think really what it's been about is not having any limits and just really having the freedom to pursue the things that I'm good at, the things that I'm interested in. I have this kind of natural leadership ability that's just kind of always been with me. and being really frustrated in certain spaces, which is part of my evolution away from some of the religious identity that I had, was there wasn't a place to express who I really was. And so I think for me, when I think about feminism, yes, Gloria Steinem and some of the women who have really pioneered it, but for me, it's really about choice and not being limited, at least by my gender, and knowing that I can kind of do whatever I kind of want to do, and there's no limits on that. So, yeah.
Well, that's so good to hear. And we try to ask this question to all of our speakers because, kind of like you said, I feel like feminism looks so different. And sometimes it gets a bad rep. And sometimes our first experiences with feminism are pretty negative.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to hear how everyone kind of grows and evolves throughout their own life. And through their experiences, they kind of find their own definition of feminism.
Yeah.
How does you've mentioned your, oh.
Yeah, I just have a question. Actually, as you're in psychology and stuff, how do you help with students when they're dealing with frustration and just not knowing if they belong, or just kind of how the coping, is a coping mechanism to that?
Yeah, definitely if they don't belong in the university setting, or just belong in general.
Yeah, especially the university settings. I guess what's your experience with how students have expressed their emotions?
Yeah, I think frustration is a really good word for it. I think sometimes there's a sense of also just inadequacy that I think comes along with it. And so I think sometimes there's this idea that because I don't have almost this pedigree, or I don't have sort of this lineage of people, that somehow I'm kind of disqualified or whatever. And so I think I really try to really validate those feelings. And then in counseling, we have something we call self-disclosure, where you might share a little bit more of yourself personally. And so I find sometimes in those spaces, I will share a little bit more about myself and kind of my journey, in a way to support the student. I think we also really look at, what does it mean to be a student? What does it mean to be successful? And how that can look very different for different people. And it's not always about making A's, and it's not always about, having all the right information all the time. So I think I try to really look at that kind of empowering piece a little bit, and reminding them that the face of education has changed a lot. It's even changed in the last 10 years. Students who have mental health concerns, or students who come from backgrounds that don't necessarily set them up for higher education, we're finding that they're making their way into colleges. And I think part of what we're called to do in higher ed is to support those students, and be flexible in how we do things. The fact we even have college counseling. I remember I went to undergrad in the late 80s, and you can all do the math for yourself, how old I am. But I remember we had a counseling center, but it was kind of back in the corner of the gym, and nobody really, and now counseling is really front and center. So students can come with those kinds of concerns and get support and realize, oh, it's okay to be here. I can be here. It's not about, I can be a college student or I can deal with my mental health. It's both. I can be a college student and I can have support for my mental health, and I can be successful, and I can, and all those things. So, yeah.
Thank you. You've mentioned briefly just kind of your identities. And so how does your overall identity impact your approach to mental health care?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the idea of intersection of identities, and that being such a important part of how we view anybody in the world, I think is a part of what I bring into my work. At the heart of what I do as a therapist, as a psychologist, is I'm very person-centered, very much focused on that person in front of me, and all their identities. And so I'm always looking through that lens of trying to understand who they are. Realizing there might be some things about them that might be representative of a certain group, but then nobody's a monolith, right? There's such variety. And so I think a lot of it is me seeing them first as a person. I supervised a nun one semester, and she probably has heard me say, we are first human in the room. We are first a human relating to a human. And so I think that's just a lot of how I just approach people in general, especially my work. So I think part of my personal intersection of identities, though, is also understanding that I come from some identities that are privileged, right? Being a white woman, for example, but I also identify as queer, and so that has its own challenges. And so I think that the more understanding I have of the complexities of who I am, makes me then appreciate more the person sitting in front of me and recognizing the complexities of who they are. Yeah. So.
I always say, I feel like self-awareness is so important, right? And like kind of discovering yourself, finding your own identity helps you interact with other people with various identities. So thank you. So you have done a lot of work with anxiety. I feel like it's very common in college students. It's common in a lot of people in this day and age. And so how are you seeing it show up today that may be different from the past?
Yeah, really good question. Anxiety and depression are the number 2 top challenges or concerns that students bring into mental health and counseling and college counseling centers. Anxiety, post-pandemic, during the pandemic, post-pandemic, not to say that I had some great insight into this, but I remember during the pandemic talking to my colleagues and saying, we're not even seeing the half of what this is going to be. Like, we are going to come out of this thing, and I think we're going to see remnants of this for a while. That's exactly what's happening. Is students coming in, a lot of more social anxiety. I feel like just not how do I relate to peers? How do I get out there and make friends? How do I relate to even dating and partnership and things like that? So I think we're seeing a real increase in. I think things like that, just coming in, just very uncertain about how to operate kind of in the world, in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. Just real hesitation to even, hey, go try a root group, or hey, join your floor in the residence hall, to do an activity, and just I don't even think I can do that, and so I think that has made. We were just talking about this in a meeting this morning. I think that's made our job as therapists, psychologists, a little more complex in that it's almost like we're kind of also saying, well, how do we sort of teach social skills, and how do we sort of help students with these things that are not necessarily directly mental health, but they definitely impact who they are and their experience on campus. So I think it's something that we're paying attention to. I think we're realizing the effects of social media. And some of those effects being positive, and some of those effects being negative. And I think we're still kind of, I know as a clinician, and I think some of my colleagues and friends are kind of finding our way through that, actually.
For sure. It's interesting how you mentioned, it's almost like with social anxiety, like how do we as therapists teach social skills? Because sometimes that seems like, what a client is struggling with is like the lack of social skills. And it makes me think of how, I feel like a lot of students come to college that are not prepared for a lot of kind of social parts of the college experience, not only in making friends, but even things like networking. Yeah. We talk about that so much. And I feel like so many students struggle with that because of anxiety as well. And so it's really affecting multiple parts of their life.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that there's this social aspect of college and developmental aspect for young adults, even that this is a time where you are taking chances and risks, and meeting partners, and that might become long-term marriage, whatever. You are making choices about your career, and so there's very much a social aspect to that. If you're already sort of struggling in that area, and then you come to college, it can be just kind of like another layer of difficulty. Yeah.
What's something that you would tell students, or just, I guess, like generally just people about anxiety that maybe isn't talked about as much? It can be really whatever you think.
Yeah, that's good. Anxiety is a part of life. And it's sort of everywhere. I think even you look at economic landscape, political landscape, for sure. Been a very stressful several years. There's just so many things in the world that are stressful, world events, the proliferation of 24/7 news media, right? And people are constantly being bombarded. So on the one hand, I would tell a student, you're not strange, you're not odd, there's not something wrong with you. Some of what's happening is sort of a result of kind of what's happening in society. At the same time, helping them understand that if you're constantly in a state of anxiety, if you're constantly in a state of sort of this heightened fear or heightened sense of, panic or whatever, that's not something that you don't have to live with that. Like, that's something we can actually treat. and give you some coping skills around, it's one thing to be fearful of a certain thing, right? Like, I always use a sort of saber-toothed tiger example, right? It's like the caveman ran from them and they protected themselves because that was a definite threat and a fear, right? What's happened in modern society is that we hear about threats overseas, and all of a sudden it becomes like that's our threat, right? So our idea of threat has kind of gotten skewed. And so, yeah, if students are struggling with, I'm fearful of tests, and I can't, I can't go into social situations. Yeah, some of that is like, yeah, that's kind of beyond what you need to just kind of live with. So, don't be afraid. Come get treatment, right? And we'll help you with that. So, yeah.
I just want to put a little plug in before I get to the question. If you're a UMKC student, you do have access to UMKC counseling services. There are very amazing, diverse providers over there that are there to help you. And so definitely check them out if you haven't. And if you're not a UMKC student, we still have CCAS here, Community Counseling and Assessment Services in the School of Education, and they're open to the public. And they're willing to kind of work with you on, how much you can afford, if that's an issue, timings, being online or in person. So yeah, if you're struggling, then there are resources for you. Chelsea, did you have a question?
I'm just going to ask them if there was a book, tool, or something anyone could access that you would recommend for anybody?
Oh gosh, that's so good. No, I think definitely there's a lot of apps out there, right? Apps is kind of the big thing. And I know that there are some breathing apps, and I won't even begin to give you names of ones because I'm not prepared to do that, but any kind of mindful breathing, mindful meditation, any kind of, I know there's a lot of apps too for like stress relief. For some students who may not be at that place where anxiety is maybe more of a pervasive issue, maybe they're just stressed out. Some of those types of things can be really helpful. Progressive muscle relaxation is one technique that I use a lot with clients that are stressed, which is this idea of sort of tensing the body and releasing muscles, and there's some deep breathing involved with it. Yeah, something you can do super easy. As a matter of fact, this is funny because I struggle sometimes with anxiety myself. That's part of what I deal with too, which is probably why I like working with it, oddly enough. Sometimes it's hard for me to fall asleep, and I was just saw this little technique on a Facebook reel of all things that's talked about doing a deep breath and then kind of picturing a different animal and picturing kind of these random objects, and it will help you fall asleep, and it totally worked. So I will say this is kind of off your question, Chelsea, but one thing I always like to tell students is there's a lot of good mental health information out there on social media. There's also a lot of really terrible information out there on social media. And so just, kind of just be cautious and sort of what you're listening to. And if you really think you have ADHD, or if you think you have a bipolar presentation, please go see a trained therapist and let us kind of work with you and help you. You can self-diagnose a lot of things based off what you kind of hear out there. So I love social media. I do a little bit of it myself, but I always like to say just also be cautious with sort of what you're consuming. So, yeah.
Yeah. Great reminder. What is the best professional advice you've ever received? So we talked about like identity and anxiety that you work with, but I know a lot of students maybe are curious about, kind of you as a professional, and because everyone's kind of working towards that, wanting to be successful. So what's the best professional advice you've ever received?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I was actually talking to one of our audience members. I won't say her name, I won't point anybody out, but we were talking about this at our office. I think when I was in my doctoral program, and this is more related to grad school and that kind of thing, but I was really struggling with coming up with a dissertation topic. I had interest in this area and that area. I remember meeting with my advisor and saying, I'm not sure I don't think I have any good ideas. And then proceeded to list about 15 things. And she started laughing and she said, I think you have too many ideas. And so I was talking with one of my mentors from my master's program, and she said, what do you want to be known for? Getting your PhD is about this idea of being specialized, right? And kind of having expertise in an area. And she said, what is it you want to be known for professionally? What is it you want to kind of put your efforts towards? And I was like, oh, that made so much sense. And so that really kind of helped me sort of, kind of cut through that. The other thing I was told was get a variety of experiences. I think this can apply to anybody. In our field, of course, you do lots of training placements in different places. And so I had a professor tell me, don't get pigeonholed into one thing. I knew I wanted to do college counseling, but they said that you never know. You never know in life what's going to happen. So get a wide variety of experiences, and so that was really helpful information. In terms of a professional, I would say I didn't get this advice, but I wish I'd gotten this advice that I think one of the parts about being a first-gen student that maybe was a little bit of a deficit for me was I don't think anybody told me as an undergrad that graduate school was possible for me, and was probably, especially for what I wanted to do, was probably the next step I needed to do. And I wish I had somebody at that point guiding me a little bit more and saying, hey, Teresa, if this is really what you want to do, this really looks like more like a master's degree. This really looks like, So I spent, I think, several years doing things that I was good at, but I don't think they were really, really fulfilling because I just didn't think about that being the next step, And so that's an advice piece that I think when I talk with students, saying, hey, there's more that you can do, and these are maybe some of the next steps. And so that's advice I wish I would have gotten. So, yeah.
No, that's great advice. I've never thought of it that way before, where what do you want to be known for?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's very profound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So on the other hand, what is the best personal advice you've ever received?
Oh, gosh. Personal advice I've ever received. Yeah, it's interesting. Because there's advice I think I received before I kind of had this, before I had this sort of evolution in my personal beliefs as a religious person. I think that there are things that I was probably told then that I would not adhere to now. I don't know. I think this sounds kind of trite maybe, but I think this idea of like, what do you want for yourself? And I think that I had a woman that I was doing kind of this like spiritual, she was doing some like spiritual direction kind of meetings with me. I was trying to sift through it. Didn't want to go back to school. It was kind of part of that process. And kind of similar to the what do you want to be known for, I think she said to me, what do you want from your life? Like, what do you want your life to look like? And actually what the process she took me through was we kind of went back kind of into my childhood, and we kind of just reviewed all the things that I liked doing and what were the things I felt naturally drawn to, and where did I feel like I was frustrated in my life. And that was it's like personal opinion advice, but it was kind of in a long process. And I think in doing that and kind of taking that pause and going, yeah, what has my life looked like up to whatever old I was at that point, was really helpful to take that kind of long look and go, okay, yeah, I really do need to go back to school, and I need to, become a mental health professional. And that really does fit into sort of this whole trajectory of my life, So I remember meeting with that spiritual advisor for about 6 months. I met with her weekly for about 6 months. And and there was other things going on in my life. But yeah, it was a really helpful time in my life to just kind of sit and pause. And I think the other thing that I kind of took away from that was, and this is probably going to be foreign to a lot of people watching because you're at that traditional age, right, of going to school. When I went back to school, I was not a traditional age. And I think there was a little part of me, because ageism is alive and well, and you learn that more and more the older you get. I think she helped me also understand that I don't have to be limited. It's not like I've turned 40 and so now you can't go back to school or you can't do these professional things, So yeah, I think that whole process of just who do you want to be, and you can still be that, and you can still pursue that, I think was a part of that whole personal kind of guidance that I received. Yeah.
Well, those are great pieces of advice. So here at the Women's Center, we have a really large library that we're very proud of. We love books here. We're always giving book recs.
I was like, I need to come over here and hang out a little bit more. So.
Yeah, no, come check us out. But we were wondering if you had a favorite book by a woman, and why is that your favorite book by a woman?
This is going way back, old school, but Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I've read that book, I think, literally 20 times, and
Classic.
I've seen all the movie versions of it. And I just think she was writing at a time when she actually was kind of presenting some feminist sort of principles in that book, you know. And again, as I look back over my life, I'm like, oh, you were kind of a feminist, Teresa, before you even really knew that you were, you know. So it's kind of a classic book that I would say. But professionally, there's a woman named Dr. Tanya Israel. She's out of, I think she's UCLA or Berkeley, I can't remember, but she's psychologist, and she's written a book called, what's it called? Beyond the Ballot or something. Anyway, she's writing about sort of this divide that we're experiencing in America, and sort of this new way, and actually a really deeper way than probably ever have, you know, in the recent past, this idea of people being on one side or the other of the political spectrum. And she's written a book about, and she's very much feminist. I think she identifies queer. She's, I believe, Asian, so she has this intersection of identities. So she's not calling for, oh, we're all the same, but she is calling for how can we kind of communicate more? How can we sort of reach out across different dividing lines and sort of come together and understand each other better as people. So I've been kind of listening to her and reading her book, and that's been really meaningful to me. So, yeah.
No, those are great recommendations. Yeah. Thank you. Who is a woman that you look up to?
Oh, well, I would say that the woman who is my spiritual director, she lives in Kansas City. So she was certainly somebody that was very instrumental in my life. Another one was, I guess I've got several that were part of my master's journey. Dr. Maria Hunt. She's out in Colorado now, and she does a lot she has her own kind of mindfulness think tank that she does a lot of work in mindfulness. Dr. Jordan Waggy, she's still teaching over at Avila. She's another one. She was the one that said, I think you've got a good brain, you know, for a PhD. So those are some immediate ones that kind of come to mind. But I think I look back over my life, and even people that sort of guided me when I was in a different space, you know, in my sort of personal beliefs. Even then, I remember having several women along the way who were encouraging, and yeah. So I think I've always had at some point in my life somebody who was kind of I was looking up to and sort of modeling. So I think that also leads me then to want to be a mentor and want to be a support to other women. Which is why I like the training part of my job, which is why I like writing letters for students. That's why I like, you know, helping encourage them as they go on in their careers and that. So I like to pass on, I think, what I've received. So, yeah.
No, I feel like it's so important to have those female role models, like as a woman, that help guide you and give you that confidence, especially if they've kind of been past or in positions that you want to be in eventually, kind of inspire you along the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Looking back now, what would you tell your college self? I think you may have talked about this a little bit already, but
I would tell my college self to be a little bit more serious about your studies. I think I had some kind of natural ability, and I think I probably coasted on that a little more than I should have, if I'm just real honest. I did not know a lot about research. I did not understand the role that research would play and be kind of moving on in this particular field. And so I wish I would know more about that. I think I think I've always been, like I said, ambitious and willing to try things, but I think I also would have been, told myself, pay attention to your gut. Pay attention to what this, because I went to a very conservative religious undergrad. Pay attention to the things that, and there were good things about that, and also things that were difficult. And I think I would have told myself, pay attention to what your gut is telling you. Do not always listen to the voices around you, and don't listen to a system. When a large system is coming at you and you're like, oh, I got to believe this. I think I would tell myself, listen to yourself, trust your heart, trust your gut, trust that instinct that you have. You know, I think some of the questions I ended up sort of asking myself, and then kind of becoming more of my authentic self, could have started a lot earlier. I think if I had had that sort of idea that listen to yourself, trust yourself. I think sometimes as women, there's this idea that we can't trust ourselves because we're too emotional, or we're this or that, and I think I would say, no, you know what you're doing. So I think some of that probably comes with age and time too, but I think back then I wish I would have done more of that. So
yeah, I mean, they do say that your gut is your second brain, and I know that UMKC Counseling Center offers a women's empowerment group, and that's actually something that when I was there training, we talked about in that group, right? Like learning how to trust yourself, like what are the signs that your gut's kind of giving you those warning bells, and like kind of how to go about that. Because you're right, I feel like women really aren't taught about trusting your gut until maybe later in life. So
yeah, it's almost as if like the gut is something like unreliable. And again, some of those tropes about women are too emotional, and we think too much with our heart. I mean, those all underlie this idea that the gut is somehow bad. And without naming names, we have people in political positions or have been in political positions that definitely have emotional outbursts and things that are not helpful, and they're not women that are doing that. So it's a good point.
All right, so we've come to the last question. What are you looking forward to, and what do you envision for the future of mental health?
Yeah, I think for the future of mental health, this kind of comes back to a kind of a basic thing, maybe, but it's what my dissertation was rooted in, and that's this idea of stigma. There still continues to be so much stigma around mental health. Having a therapist, taking medication. And I can say that there's been a couple of points in time where medication was very helpful for me with my anxiety. There's been times in counseling was very helpful with that. There's been times when, like right now, I think I'm in a good place with it all, But I think we continue to, nobody has any qualms about saying, yeah, I went to the eye doctor today, right? Sometimes it's a little bit harder to say, well, I saw my therapist today. I do think that's shifting, and I do think as Gen Z is coming through, and I guess the next one is, I think they're calling it Gen Alpha. I'm not sure. I am seeing, I think, less and less of that stigma. So that's always the thing I'm hopeful for, is that the more we sort of move forward, the more it becomes more and more mainstream, and that's, I think. So we are seeing this generation come in with a lot more anxiety, right, coming out of the pandemic. But I'm so glad they're here, because it's also, they are normalizing too, again, this idea I can go to school and be dealing with some of these things, and I can do both, So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to support students like that. I think I'm still hopeful that stigma will, at some point, maybe after I'm gone, but that it'll become less and less of an issue for students coming in and getting the help that they really could be, that really could be helpful to them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions.
Well, it's really fun to do this. It's also a little bit scary, very vulnerable, which is, I always remember that with my clients. It's a lot to come in and talk about your life, So, but thank you for letting me be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, you did great, and you gave us a lot of wisdom and advice, so we really appreciate it.
I hope so. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yeah.
What would you say to your clients who are more externally anxious about, like, not school, but like outside events, like, global warming, the current, like, political scene, things that they can't really change? Like, what would you say to them?
That's a really, really great question. And I think about that a lot, which is going to sound strange, but I, in some ways, let's normalize it. Just say, what you're experiencing is a kind of a universal thing. I'm experiencing it. Other people are experiencing it. We do know that in our sort of mental health suffering or in our concerns, one of the things that helps us actually feel better about that is to have a shared experience. This is why I'll put a plug in for group therapy. This is why group therapy is so powerful, because you're in a group of people who have a shared experience. So I think the first thing I would do is sort of normalize that and say, we're sort of part of the human family. The other thing we would probably be talking about would be, and this is very practical, but what can we control and what can we not? One thing we can control is the flow of information. And I think sometimes, especially for students who are very activist oriented, which I love, but sometimes they have to learn, like, you can't take a 24/7 stream of that. You just can't. The human mind was not designed to take in that sort of flood of existential threats over and over and over again, right? So some of this is helping them take care of themselves, right? Yes, the planet feels like it's on fire. Yes, there's an existential threat. Yes, global warming is this thing. And at the same time, you got to take care of yourself. You know, you want to do these things. You want to live this life. Well, I want to help you get there, but part of that is going to be you have to turn off some of that a little bit, if that makes sense, you know. So it's almost like this idea of how do we sort of fight against those things, right? How do we be activists? How do we care about those things and work about those things? And at the same time, how do we take care of ourselves, right? And have that sort of that balance of the two. Hopefully that's kind of helpful and gives you, yeah.
To add on to that, it's really interesting how you mentioned, like something that you recommend is like finding community and like in a group therapy where like you find similar people that think the same or struggling through the same and kind of talk with them and kind of normalize it together. Because at the Women's Center, we do a book club where you don't have to even read the book. You just come and discuss it with us. And we recently read Cassandra Speaks. And in that, there was a section on imposter syndrome. And they said that imposter syndrome was most common in women, and then more specifically in women of color. And one of the ways that she recommended kind of lessening that imposter syndrome was talking to other women who experience imposter syndrome, right? Because I feel like sometimes we feel like we're the only ones, or that we just have to handle this ourselves, when I bet that if you mention it, you know, in a room full of women or other people that think similarly to you, like everyone will be like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one. And it can be so therapeutic. So, it's interesting that you say that.
Yeah. I feel like that ties into the positive things that come out of social media, like connecting with other people with this kind of social relationship. Yeah. But also, you really got to curate that feed to positive things. I mean, there's so many who I follow. I think it's called Good Co or something. I don't know. There's a couple accounts that's like only good news. Yeah. And then there's like, you know, here's how many trees were saved the other day in this rainforest. Yeah. And like, it just gives you all these things that are not going to be in mainstream news. They're not going to be like, you know,
good news never makes headlines.
Right. Well, and part of that, I think from psychology is that because we want to survive as a species, there's always been this internal, back to the idea of anxiety, there's this internal thing that wants to survive, right? That's why we have to be aware of the threats. But at some point, so we already are sort of attuned as people to kind of notice the negative. So I think you're absolutely right, Chelsea. There has to become this effort to say, no, I'm going to focus on the good. One Instagram page that I follow is The Doggist. And he's this guy in New York City who goes around and he just goes up to people and asks to take pictures. Do you know who it is? I follow that guy. Yeah, and he interviews them and their dogs, and he takes beautiful pictures of these dogs. So when I'm like, okay, it's been a long day. There's a lot going on in the world, a lot going on with people. I'm like, let's see what the dogs are doing, and we have to have that, right? Because you think about it, why are we fighting for things we're fighting for? Why are we standing up, as feminists? Why are we doing these things? Because we want the world to be better. And so it's not wrong, and it's actually helpful to then take moments and go, yeah, okay, not everything is terrible in the world. The Doggist is out there, and he's photographing the dogs, and people are out there, and they are doing things, right? Otherwise, it just becomes this over and over. It's just negative all the time, and that would be very that's really wears you down, right? We want to know that our efforts are actually doing something. So
I feel like as generations go by, the more and more it's like they cope with humor. Yeah. Like you have to like make light of some dark situations sometimes. And, whether it's like your dopamine menu or like your coping skills list, find ways to take care of yourself when it's just really heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And also that kind of self-care being commodified. Like, no, you really got to think about what your self-care looks like for you. And it's not just go buy all this stuff.
Right.
Practice self-care. You can do.
Yeah. Well, and I think for people who identify as female, we do know that, there are a lot of us who kind of carry a lot of that emotional load in the world anyway. Whether that's for families or for friends or for just society, right? And a lot of that labor kind of falls to those of us who identify as women and female identified. And so we have to refuel. We have to take those breaks out. The other idea too is, of course, that those who are male identified also have empathy, and they also have nurturing ability. And I think that's also part of feminism, right? Is recognizing that we're all humans. We all have these characteristics, right? And that can be nurtured or whatever. So, but the way things stand, I think especially those of us that identify as women, it's a lot to carry sometimes. Yeah. So you have to have that taking care of yourself. Yeah.
Going back to some mistakes, chapter that I read was the author Leslie, she kind of ran this group discussion or mediation for all the firefighters and policemen who had to serve during 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
New York, the chaos, it was chaotic and everything. So she got to them, firstly, talking about their emotions and talking about their feeling and stuff. But then she was trying to ask them, hey, can you admit that you're scared, that you don't know what's gonna happen, and basically none of them admitted. It's oh, we're men, we don't cry.
Yeah.
And they went to oh yeah, we gotta uphold that base because we gotta provide for our families and stuff.
Yeah.
Then after a couple of years, one of the men sent her a letter. It's you know what, I do he kind of admitted yeah, she was right. You have to let your emotions out. Yeah. Until it consumes because he survived 2 strokes and 1 death.
Wow. Yeah. 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 Well, that's I can't remember the exact quote, but it's this idea that patriarchy hurts everybody, right? It hurts everyone across the spectrum of individuals. Everyone needs to get support. Everyone needs to express their emotions. That's a great example, I think, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Another account that I follow is the Man Enough podcast.
I've not heard of that one.
It's good.
Okay, I'll have to check it out.
We actually have a book by the guy that runs it. But they post positive masculinity things every week, a Friday thing.
Yeah.
It's just there's all these positive things happening.
Yeah.
In life, and it's so
Yeah.
nice to see.
Yeah.
Also, it's Weight Stigma Awareness Week, and oh my gosh, the change that I experienced when I was intentionally following people my size and that looked like me, that were doing all the fashion things, because they're typically would see on all the same size people.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that changed my whole experience.
Yeah.
It's the importance of catering your feed to you.
Yeah. But intentionally follow. So now I'm following older women, people that have gray hair, just really searching for you out there. Maybe that's but not in a bad way. But I feel that is a positive thing.
Yeah.
To just be affirmed that there's joyous people that just like you out there.
Well, and I think it's, we've known this for a long time. It's as women have gotten older in your life, you kind of feel like you become less and less relevant, maybe, right? You think about actresses who are well, I don't get asked to do as many films. Think about the older actors men who still get these roles, right? And the women are kind of relegated, to these side roles or whatever. Or once your kids are grown, I think women who have children sometimes can feel, I don't have children, so I'm just kind of speculating, but I know that I've had friends of mine talk about, they don't feel as relevant. It's the kids don't need me, right? And so I think it's really important that we realize ageism and sizeism and all the other, parts of identity that we don't really talk about as much. It's so important that we do, because I want to be just as relevant at 80 as I am now, right? I still want to be doing important things and speaking to students, and, I want to do all those things, and not feel oh gosh, at some certain age now you're not really important anymore. You're not really part of what's going on, and we need those women who are role models out there. And we need to, to cultivate that. Yeah, I can have gray hair and that's okay. That's good. That's not a bad thing, So. we could go on for a long, long time about all that stuff for sure. But
Okay, another question I have is, how important do you feel like it is to find a therapist that aligns with your identity and your values?
yeah, that's been so much on my mind this week. I think anytime we have sort of a shared identity with somebody, there's that sense of maybe community, right? Like, oh, we believe some similar things, or we have some similar experiences. And we know from the research, I always go back to the research, right? Being a good PhD, holder. We do know, especially for persons of color, and especially like around trauma, I think that there are certain things where that can be very helpful even if to speak somebody in your own language, even know some of the research, right? Like if you speak another language other than English, it'd be helpful to process with a therapist who has that, So we know there's to a certain extent that there's those shared identities that can be helpful. The other thing, though, is unfortunately, unless you're going to be private practice and pay privately and live in an area that's super diverse, unfortunately, we probably can't. We don't have all the representation of all the identities and all the intersection of identities, right? And so I want to say that, yes, if you can find somebody with some shared identities, that can be really helpful. However, if you don't, look for a therapist, though, who is multiculturally sensitive, who values diversity, who values, the intersection of identities, who, is a safe space for the queer community, right? Who has an appreciation for different religions and things like that, right? And that's something you can even ask somebody in the first appointment, or even when you schedule the appointment, right? Because there's a lot of us that who've been trained in this field to recognize those things as being important, right? So I do think somebody can see somebody who has differing identities and still have a very good experience. Yeah.
Does AMKC concept such have that option of like choosing which kind of therapist they want, whether it's gender or age and race, or?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, Noon. Yeah, we certainly try to, if students have a preference, we certainly try to do that. Because we are a limited staff, we do our best. I guess I want to answer that. Yeah. So yeah, students can request that. Sometimes that works out. Sometimes it doesn't. We've also referred people to the community at some point if they're done working with us, and they, they maybe didn't get to have that experience. We will look in the community for them for that, for that type of identification, where they identify with their counselor. So yeah, always something they can request, but we have to just do our best to try to meet that. Yeah. These are just things we talked about today, so it's kind of funny because it's fresh on my mind, and it's funny because it's good to hear from students what they're thinking too, So yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Huff-Pomstra, and to everyone who came in person and tuned in on the live. We will be having more Feminist Fireside chats just like this, and so we urge everyone to come and join. So yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.